Welcome to Social Studies Samurai. In this video, we're going to show you how to analyze political cartoons and understand the techniques that cartoonists use to try to persuade you and me. Okay, and before we really begin, let me just tell you that you can find this slide deck and other links and things in the YouTube description. So, how do we analyze a political cartoon? Well, first, what are political cartoons? You can see on the right here, the image is surrounded by text. Well, that's because political cartoons were in traditional newspapers, even in print newspapers as they are today and online, but they were found in the editorial section, which is why we also call political cartoons editorial cartoons. Now, keep in mind that a political cartoon gives the artist's opinion, right, on current events and issues that are happening in the world at the time or a country, but it's their intent to persuade you and the audience that their idea is right. And often that idea is the same one of the news organizations that use their cartoons. They use satire, humor and exaggeration and things like that, and a variety of other techniques to try to draw your attention to an issue. Usually you're going to see well-known people, trends, important issues depicted in those cartoons, but sometimes just large groups of people to represent, for example, a smaller group of, commoners, for example. Why should we study political cartoons? This is probably like the most important comment here. We are so influenced by the things that we read and see and hear. And sometimes we don't even realize it. So, are we being persuaded? Well, political cartoons, like we said, are there to persuade you. So we need to know what they're trying to, why they're trying to persuade us. So we need to develop the ability to analyze cartoons. We have to develop our own opinions, and we can do that by ideally looking at political cartoons from a range of different sources and news organizations from around the world on the same issue, to give us multiple perspectives so we can make informed decisions and really choose, what is it that I believe. Remember, the cartoons are the opinions of the cartoonist first, and usually supported by the newspaper. Sometimes the cartoonist loses their job because something gets printed and there's a big backlash, right? So what techniques do they use? They use a whole pile of them, and usually you see a group, not just one or two in any cartoon. They use visuals, like you can see on the left side here. Looks like a cartoon panel. They use text, labels, captions, and speech bubbles, like the ones on the right here. Symbolism, caricature, hyperbole, analogies, irony, stereotyping, size, and juxtaposition. We're going to go through all of these. So now it's time for you to think a little bit deeper here. So what techniques do we see in this French Revolution era political cartoon? It was actually a little bit after the French Revolution. But before we jump in, anytime you analyze a source, whether it's an image, a piece of text, a cartoon, whatever, you have to ask yourself a whole pile of questions. No, I am not going to read all these questions to you, but some important ones are: who made it? When did they make it? Where did they make it? Why did they make it? You got to think about, things like, the purpose that this thing was made. You can go through these questions on your own a little bit later. So let's get to it. So a little bit of background context, right? So this is a French Revolution era cartoon, really post-French Revolution. It was done by George Cruikshank, and this is an etching. He was a British cartoonist, right? So he was French, so keep that in mind. Or he was not French, so keep that in mind, right? This guy even illustrated for Charles Dickens, which I think is interesting. It was published in 1819, so this was actually, a good generation or more after the French Revolution. It was not long after the Napoleonic Wars, though. So, there was still this sentiment in Britain, some anger still remaining towards the French because they were mortal enemies during, the French Revolution period and afterwards. Keep in mind, too, that in Britain at the time, there were a lot of lower class people that were disenfranchised. They were poor. They didn't have really good lives. They were living day to day. People like laborers and farmers and factory workers. They weren't living the good life. They didn't have a big middle class like we do in a lot of Western industrialized countries today. So the idea of a revolution happening in what used to be a stable monarchy in France, that would have scared the crap out of people in other European countries, in particular the elites. So what techniques do they use? All right, so visuals. This one is loaded with visuals, but let's take it in a holistic idea overall, right? So here we've got the guillotine. We've got a couple of French peasants that are drunk. They're looking pretty ragged. They're dancing over this guillotine that was a tool to kill tens of thousands of people during the French Revolution, hanging over this burning globe. Whoa, this is a negative tone. Remember, British newspaper, right? And British artist. They use labels, right? So at the top here, you've got no God, no religion, no king, no constitution. Well, those things were important to the elites, in Europe at the time. So, that's making a point that these people, these ragged people, don't have that, right? So those labels help you understand the point of the cartoon. Captions. Well, if you look down below, you can see it says the radical's arm, the radical's arms. And radicals were those people that want swift, quick change and it's abrupt. And sometimes a radical change can be really, really violent. So again, they're taking this radical term and placing it upon these two people. Who were those two French peasants? I'll tell you what their group was called in a moment. So, speech bubbles, they usually you're often going to find them in political cartoons, sometimes not even a bubble but just a line drawn to the person's head or mouth, and that kind of shows you what they're saying, gives their opinion or whatever, and that can usually be done with humor, even exaggeration, sarcasm. Now this cartoon is loaded with symbolism. So up here where you see these four statements, right? No God, no religion, no king, no constitution. Well, that's the French tricolor cockade, and it was a symbol of the French Revolution. The three colors they represented actually the three estates. Right, that was the government at the time when the revolution broke out. The clergy were blue, the nobility were white. The third estate, which was kind of the wealthier of the lower classes, who represented 7% of the population, well, they were in red, right? You also see the guillotine here, right? And of course, you see images, clergy and nobility and that kind of thing. But the guillotine was now we see as a symbol of the French Revolution because so many people were basically murdered with it. And I'll tell you, that was not a pleasant experience, right? When you get so many people in a day that would get their heads chopped off with this thing, it would kind of, the wood here, it would get caught in the wood. Sometimes it would come down to the person's head and it would slice halfway through the head because it got so rickety and overused. And the blood, I mean, think of all the blood, right? I mean, metal rusts, right? So then you got this rusty blade coming down on some people. We also have other symbols in here. We've got these axes and they're bloodied, and you've got the nooses hanging, right? So you got the gallows idea here. Down at the bottom, you see the royal regalia. See the crown flipped upside down. That's deliberate. And then you see like the clergy's headwear and things like that. So obviously they're saying that they've murdered the nobility and the clergy and they've cut their heads off. Loads of symbolism going on in here. Keep in mind we have other kinds of symbolism in cartoons. Like today we'd have the Uncle Sam for America, the dollar sign to represent money, or money bags. You'd have the big Russian bear or the hammer and sickle for communist countries. Yes, there are more. A caricature. Well, these two people that you see right here, you can tell that they're exaggerated. Although they're drunk and they're reveling, they're partying, but they look pretty ragged. Well, basically, this is caricature of peasants called the sans-culottes. And in the nobility, the nobility during the French Revolution, they wore these knee-high breeches like socks, culotte, and and that was a symbol of their wealth, of course, because peasants, you didn't really see them wearing these. So they called themselves sans-culottes, and sans-culotte means without the knee breeches, right? Without those long, stockings kind of thing. Hyperbole is something else that we see too. We see things that are exaggerated, whether they're words and whether they're images. We could suggest perhaps there's hyperbole in here with the sans-culotte, but that's actually more caricature. Analogies, we often see this. This is when there's a comparison between two things. Sometimes they're placed close together to have some kind of contrasting effect. We don't see that in here, but we'll put that in another video. Irony. Irony is the difference between things that, the way things are and the way things should be or they're expected to be. Again, we don't really see that here as well. Stereotyping we do see. right? Because these images that we see of these French peasants being murderous and celebrating the death of people at the hands of the guillotine. Um, it's creating a stereotype of these crazy, radical, wild French peasants. So we do see stereotype in cartoons quite a lot, and sometimes you'll see backlash in newspapers because of stereotypes that are seen. Often we might see size in a cartoon. We'll have one object that looks really big and one that's really small. Um, maybe you'll have a symbol of the, Uncle Sam standing very, very tall over a smaller symbol of maybe the Canadian beaver. I'm Canadian, so the beaver a lot smaller than Uncle Sam, when especially standing so tall. And Canada economically is a smaller country and militarily than the United States. That would be a good use of size. We'll show some later. Juxtaposition. Two things being placed or close next to each other when they have a contrasting effect. Again, we don't really see that in this cartoon, but we'll explore that in future videos. So now it's time to think a little bit more like Ninja, right? Get a little bit deeper in our thinking. We're going to talk about how cartoons might appeal to your emotions or your logical senses. So these are referred to as rhetorical devices, and they're used to persuade you. We've got pathos, ethos, and logos. What are they? So the pathos is something that evokes an emotion in the viewer, right? And in this one, because we see the violence of the French Revolution and these two people celebrating it, for the British public at the time, the point of this would have been to get them to think, oh, those rabid French peasants, it would have been to get a negative view of them. It was supposed to get an emotional response from the violence of the French Revolution. Ethos is another tool that's used to convince the audience that the artist is an authority. The artist knows what they're talking about. In today's world, you might see in a byline of a newspaper, it'll say award-winning cartoonist and then their name, or it might have their name and then PhD next to it or something like that. You'll see that with any kind of source that you might evaluate. And then there's the logos. Logos uses evidence and facts and statistics to try to convince you that their argument is correct. So they use facts and statistics to support their argument. Sometimes you see that in political cartoons. You definitely see it in editorial writing and other kinds of writing. So that was a really quick overview of how we analyze political cartoons. Check out some of the other videos. We're going to do some other ones focusing on certain things like juxtaposition and irony, etc. And you can find us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and at socialstudiessamurai.com. And go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Go ahead. We know you wanna.